Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be going over pretty much everything you need to know about hormones, as well as the three types of hormones and how they're different, how they're similar, and how I like to remember what each hormone is, so what falls under the peptide versus steroid, okay? So first of all, steroid hormones are going to be derived from cholesterol, and I have the structure of cholesterol right here. Main thing you have to know is that it has four uh, carbon rings right here, carbon hydrogen rings. Three of them are going to be made of six-membered rings. You can see one, two, and three. And then the fourth one is going to be a five-membered ring. So, and because of this structure, it's going to be mostly nonpolar, like very strongly nonpolar. There is one OH group right there you can see at the bottom. However, that's not really enough to make it polar at all. So it's obviously nonpolar. So what does this mean? This means that the steroid hormones are able to diffuse through the membrane of the cell. And why is this? So you can imagine the phospholipid bilayer right here. These are going to be hydrophilic heads, and then the tails are going to be hydrophobic. And you can imagine, so the inside is hydrophobic, and the steroids itself are hydrophobic because they're nonpolar. So they're able to dissolve through here, and they're able to move through it. Whereas a peptide hormone that's hydrophilic is not really going to want to do that, right? So steroid hormones are able to diffuse through the cell membrane, which also goes into how they work, how they produce their desired effect, is that they act on gene expression. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that they're going to diffuse through the cell membrane, and then they're going to bind to some sort of receptor on the inside of the cell. So we have it right here. Think of it as a receptor. It binds to it, and then this can go. This is either in the cytoplasm or the nucleus, right? So it's going to go to then it's going to go to the nucleus, and it's going to alter gene expression. And because of this, it's going to take some time for the gene expression for us to see the effect of it. So it's going to take, that's why it's slow acting. However, when it does act, it's going to be long lasting. It's going to last for a long time. And then these are the six steroid hormones that you have to know. A lot of these you can kind of memorize because of their name, where it ends in "-one", right? Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, aldosterone. These sound pretty similar, except estrogen, I guess. But so then, and then there's androgens, aldosterone and cortisol, and these three are going to be produced by the adrenal cortex. So the adrenal cortex is actually the outer part of the adrenal gland. So you can see it right here. This part right here is the cortex. And the way to memorize what these hormones are is to just think of the mnemonic triple S. And what this tells you is pretty much the function of these three hormones. So there's the salt function, and this is going to be their aldosterone. What aldosterone will do is it's going to work on the collecting duct of the nephron, as well as the distal convoluted tubule of the nephron. And what it's going to do is it's going to increase the amount of sodium that gets reabsorbed into the blood, and it's going to promote the expulsion of potassium out of the blood. But pretty much what's going to happen is that water is going to follow the sodium that gets moved back in, because there's a lot of sodium moving in due to osmosis. Water's going to follow it, and it's going to increase the blood pressure. Okay, so that's why it's salt, because it's moving salts, Na and K+. Sugar refers to cortisol. So cortisol is going to increase the amount of gluconeogenesis, so that's when you produce glucose. And gluconeogenesis, it kind of makes sense, because it's just cortisol, you might know it as a stress hormone. And in times of stress, it's pretty useful to have more glucose, more energy for whatever purpose. So yeah, that's why cortisol increases glucose. And then the sex hormones are androgens, so these are hormones that produce male sex traits, and testosterone actually falls under androgens. Okay, so those are all the steroid hormones, and you can probably memorize that list pretty easily, as well as memorize the amino acid-derived hormones. And if you do those two, then pretty much you can assume that anything else is going to be a peptide hormone. Okay, so first of all, generally, what do we know about peptide hormones? Well, they're going to be polar, because they're made up of peptides. They're made up of amino acids that are linked together in a chain, which is what a peptide is. And that means that instead of diffusing through the cell membrane, they're going to actually bind to extracellular receptors, and they're going to use secondary messenger pathways such as CAMP. Okay, and what this means is that they're going to be fast acting, because they can directly do whatever their function is, but they're not going to last a long time because they're not changing gene expression. Okay, so So then we can kind of think of them as several groups of peptide hormones. I divided it in like this as a, but we can just start off with the flat peg hormones. So these are all the hormones that are made up by the anterior pituitary gland. So pretty much all of these hormones are going to be produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and they can be divided into either tropic hormones and direct hormones. Okay. Also, yeah, one thing about these glands is that hypothalamus is what induces the anterior pituitary gland to make these hormones. Okay, so the hypothalamus is going to make some hormone, which is going to go to the anterior pituitary gland to make these 7 hormones. Okay, and these 7 hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland are going to be either tropic, which is the first 4, or direct, which is the last 3. So tropic means that it's going to go and make, it's going to release another hormone. So it's going to go and work on another gland it's going to release some sort of hormone, okay? Whereas a direct hormone is going to go and directly do its function. So it's not going to produce another hormone, okay? So we have FSH first of all, which is going to release it's follicular stimulating hormone. So it's going to stimulate the production of the follicles, which is your eggs in women. And then there's also sperm, which is going to, you could kind of think of them as similar functions, right, in men, because they're both like the gametes. Then there's a luteinizing hormone. This is what in women it's going to release. It's responsible for ovulation. So the surge of luteinizing hormone that's going to release the egg into the fallopian tube. And then in men, there's going to be testosterone, which is produced and released. And then there's ACTH, which releases cortisol. And then there's also thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to release T3 and T4, which are actually amino acid-derived hormones, which we're going to go over them there after this. However, TSH, remember that TSH is actually a peptide hormone, but T3 and T4 are amino acid-derived, right? But the actual hormone itself, TSH, is a peptide hormone. Then there's a direct hormone that's going to directly do their purpose, to directly do their function, their goal, whatever it is. So prolactin is going to make milk. Endorphins will decrease feelings of pain, which are going to produce feelings of euphoria, so really good feelings, right? And then growth hormones are going to be responsible for growing both taller and stronger. Okay, so then there's the posterior pituitary gland, which is going to store the hormones made by the hypothalamus. So these are hormones made by the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary gland is not going to make any hormones, remember that. That's very important. And these 2 hormones are antidiuretic hormone as well as oxytocin. So antidiuretic hormone, the way it works is it's going to act on the collecting duct of the nephron, and what it's going to do is it's going to increase the amount of aquaporins, which pretty much just allows more water to move through back into the blood. So again, it's going to increase the blood pressure. It's different from antidiuretic, or it's different from aldosterone, because that's going to do it through osmosis, whereas this will do it directly through aquaporins. Okay? And then there's oxytocin. So oxytocin is involved in the positive feedback loop of when a woman gives birth. So what happens is that there's a contraction made by the baby as it's starting to come out, right? Contraction, what's going to happen is going to go to the hypothalamus to produce oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to travel down and it's going to drive stronger contractions, right? And this will produce more oxytocin. It's going to be a positive feedback loop until the baby comes out. Okay? Those are the 2 hormones that you should know about the posterior pituitary gland. And then we can remember that there's the thyroid and parathyroid. So these are right here, right where your throat is. There's the parathyroid gland and parathyroid gland. Thyroid gland. So let's see. So first of all, I like to remember the parathyroid, what it does first. So first of all, they both have the letter P, so I remember that parathyroid makes the bones perish. Okay? So what is it going to do? It's going to break down bones. And what is the result of that? Well, it's going to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. Okay? And how is it going to do this? It's going to increase osteoclast activity. So what is osteoclast? These are what chew, right? Clast for chew. They're going to chew the bone up. So that's how we increase the calcium. And then thyroid hormone is actually going to do the opposite. So it's going to release a hormone called calcitonin. And if it's going to do the opposite, then it's just going to make the bones stronger. There's going to be less Ca2 plus in the blood. And it's going to do this by inhibiting osteoclasts. So that should kind of make sense to you, hopefully. So then finally we have the pancreas for the peptide hormones. there's going to be the alpha islet cells, beta islet cells, and gamma islet cells. These are all going to make peptide hormones. And again, these peptide hormones, so the glucagon is going to be responsible for, okay, first of all, the way I like to remember it is glucagon is going to be released when glucose is gone. So when you have a low amount of glucose, glucagon is released. So what does that mean? It means that your body needs some sort of way to increase the amount of glycogen, or the amount of glucose in your blood, right? So how is it going to do this? Well, glycogen is how we store glucose. So obviously, if we break down glycogen, we can have more glucose in the blood. So that's how I like to remember it. Glucagon, when glucose is gone, it's going to promote the breakdown of glycogen. It's going to increase glucose. Beta islet cells, these are kind of the opposite. You can think of it. So insulin is going to be released when there's a lot of glucose in the blood. So then we have a lot of glucose. It doesn't really make sense for us to. We already have a lot of energy. We don't need to make more glucose, right? So we'd rather store it for later use. So this is why insulin is important for glycogen formation. And then there's the gamma islet cells, which are going to make somatostatin. It's going to just inhibit both of these. So you can think of it as regulating both the alpha and the beta islet cells. Okay. So those are actually all the peptide hormones. So again, it's quite a lot of hormones to remember, but just literally remember, if it's not one of these 6 and not one of these 4, then it's going to be a peptide hormone. And then, yeah. So the amino acid derived hormones, what is the difference between this and a peptide hormone? Because they kind of sound similar, right? Peptide hormone is peptide chain. Well, amino acid derived hormone is going to be a hormone derived from a single amino acid. It's not going to be a peptide chain, okay? It's only one amino acid that's derived and altered in some way, and they're going to have mixed characteristics. So you don't really have to memorize like what the method of whether it's going to have characteristics that are similar to both steroid and peptide hormones, right? They're kind of like wishy-washy, so you don't really have to memorize that. But what you do have to know is which ones are amino acid derived hormones. So there's epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these are going to be released by the adrenal medulla. So remember the medulla. Remember the cortex is going to make the triple S mnemonic, which I talked about, the peptide hormone, or sorry, the steroid hormones. Whereas the center, the adrenal medulla, is going to make these epinephrine, norepinephrine, and you should know these as adrenaline. So obviously when your sympathetic nervous system is activated and you need some sort of, you need extra energy, then that's what this is gonna give you. Okay, so then there's T3 and T4, which are released by the thyroid gland. Again, remember these are all amino acid derived. These are actually all of these hormones right here listed. These 4 hormones are all derived from tyrosine. Okay, so you should know that. And yeah, so T3 and T4 are made by the thyroid gland, and they're going to increase metabolism. So that literally means they're just going to be increase the amount of energy that you're going to use, okay? So you're using more energy to whatever, right? You're using more energy, using more heat, everything. Your metabolic rates are going to increase, okay? And T3 and T4, you have to know that T3 is more potent than T4, but again, it's not really that important, but that's the main thing you should know about each one. So again, just remember these are the amino acid derived hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, T3 and T4. That's not too hard to remember. And then remember the testosterone, estrogen, androgen, progesterone, aldosterone, and cortisol are the steroid hormones. And then if you have any other hormone, you can just kind of assume that it's a peptide hormone, and just remember the general activity of each one important. That's the most important thing.